In this podcast episode, Ben Shapiro discusses a range of urgent and controversial topics, including the brutal crackdown on protesters in Iran, the silence of American college activists on this issue, President Trump's stance and potential actions, ongoing ICE enforcement controversies, and a pivotal Supreme Court case concerning transgender participation in girls' sports. Shapiro also touches on economic developments, critiques of the Federal Reserve, and ongoing political drama surrounding Jeffrey Epstein and Greenland's geopolitical status. Reports suggest thousands, potentially up to 20,000, protesters are being killed by the Iranian regime amid mass anti-government demonstrations. The Iranian people have risen against the clerical establishment they blame for worsening economic collapse and continuous oppression. Despite brutal crackdowns involving live ammunition, arrests, and internet blackouts, protests persist. Unlike past U.S. administrations, the Trump administration imposed maximum sanctions and increased pressure on Iran, weakening its economy and military support networks. Shapiro criticizes the absence of substantial public support from college activists and congressional Democrats for the Iranian protesters. He highlights the tragic contrast of social media bravery versus the real courage demonstrated by Iranians facing gunfire for freedom. President Trump has responded by canceling meetings with Iranian officials and threatening strong action if executions of dissidents occur, affirming solidarity with the protesters and signaling help is on the way. Donald Trump emphasizes continued protests inside Iran and promises serious consequences for regime violence, including targeted strikes against military assets if the regime escalates its repression. Trump rejects prior Obama-era policies of appeasement and expresses skepticism toward proposals within the U.S. administration to negotiate with Iran. He endorses tactical measures such as increasing tariffs on nations trading with Iran, and is considering efforts to restore internet connectivity in Iran, potentially through smuggling Starlink devices to counter the government's communications blackout. Shapiro notes Trump's unique reputation for following through on red lines and distinguishes this approach from the perceived failures of Obama and Biden in Middle East policy. While many speculate on what might replace Iran's regime, Shapiro argues the current government is uniquely malign, being the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism and a threat to regional stability. The podcast addresses the heightened federal immigration enforcement efforts under the Trump administration, particularly in states like Minnesota, where local governments resist cooperation with ICE. Shapiro criticizes Democratic leaders and activist groups for opposing ICE and labels their refusal to cooperate as politically motivated and harmful to public safety. He advocates for local law enforcement to collaborate with federal authorities to deport criminal illegal immigrants efficiently. Trump's policy to withhold federal payments to sanctuary cities from February 1st is highlighted as a logical consequence of non-cooperation. Despite political rhetoric painting ICE agents as antagonists, Shapiro frames the agency as essential to removing dangerous individuals from communities. The fallout from the shooting of an ICE officer named Renee Good and subsequent investigations also raises tensions, with some federal prosecutors resigning in protest over government inquiries into activist groups allegedly impeding enforcement. A major Supreme Court case is dissected, focusing on whether states can ban biological boys from competing in girls' sports. Conservative justices question the scientific basis and legal definitions surrounding sex and transgender identity, emphasizing the physical advantages males generally have in athletic competition. The inability of the opposing legal side to offer clear definitions for sex under the law complicated arguments about equal protection and anti-discrimination statutes. The case reveals the challenges courts face in reconciling biological sex with gender identity in policy and law, as well as the broader cultural and moral implications. Shapiro underscores the absurdity of the situation given the fundamental physical differences between males and females, and critiques the judiciary's evasions and contortions on this issue. President Trump's recent speeches celebrate robust economic growth rates, citing GDP expansion and a so-called disinflationary boom. He touts increased business investment and rising household incomes while noting that inflation is trending favorably. Despite claims of a manufacturing renaissance, Shapiro notes that U.S. manufacturing jobs have not significantly increased, though investment in emerging technologies, especially artificial intelligence, is surging. Trump's persistent pressure on Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell to lower interest rates draws criticism from Shapiro, who questions the logic given that rate cuts could fuel inflation rather than improve affordability. The episode points out the political risks of antagonizing the Fed and the importance of central bank independence, especially amid ongoing federal investigations and subpoenas related to Powell. Shapiro comments on continued, yet arguably stagnating, public and political interest in the Jeffrey Epstein case. Efforts by some lawmakers to link President Trump to any cover-up are dismissed as baseless and politically motivated. Tensions escalated when a federal worker insulted Trump during a public appearance, receiving a sharp response. Meanwhile, the Clintons face congressional subpoenas to testify about their relationship to Epstein, but have refused to appear, prompting threats of contempt of Congress. Shapiro doubts the political momentum behind pursuing these claims further without stronger evidence, noting ongoing opposition from within the Democratic establishment and the complexity of federal investigations. The discussion turns to Greenland, where the premier has expressed a preference to remain part of Denmark rather than join the U.S., much to President Trump's chagrin. The U.S. has existing defense agreements allowing construction and military activity on the island, considered vital for national security, particularly for missile defense systems like the proposed Golden Dome. Trump's insistence on greater American control over Greenland is portrayed as strategic leverage in geopolitical maneuvering, although no immediate plans for military action or annexation are anticipated. Shapiro views Greenland as an important asset in global power dynamics involving Russia and China and stresses the benefit of controlling it for NATO's strength. Throughout the episode, Shapiro plugs upcoming streaming content such as the Pendragon Cycle, Rise of the Merlin, highlighting its cinematic quality and mythological story set before King Arthur. He also mentions his recent podcast appearance with California Governor Gavin Newsom. The conversation briefly touches on broader cultural issues and ongoing political conflicts, including debates over integrity in law enforcement and ideological battles on topics like immigration enforcement and transgender rights. Shapiro critiques the polarization around ICE enforcement and the broader immigration debate, emphasizing practical governance and legal cooperation rather than ideological grandstanding. He notes the political calculations behind Democratic extremism on these issues, especially in anticipation of upcoming elections. The podcast closes with observations about the fractures and unifying tendencies within the Republican Party, particularly in relation to foreign policy decisions on Iran and national security. Shapiro stresses that targeted military action against Iran is unlikely to divide MAGA voters and could have significant geopolitical ramifications.